Wonderful to see you all. My name is Rob Barnsby. On behalf of the Army Cyber Institute of West Point, I'd like to welcome you to our legal panel discussing the future of law as it relates to cyber conflict. The timing of this panel is excellent in light of the recent release of Tallinn Manual 2.0, the latest version of the landmark publication examining the application of existing rules and principles of law to cyber operations during both peacetime and in armed conflict. Ambassador Calderon spoke about this morning, the importance of understanding the law as it relates to whatever line of work you're in, because international law applies to cyberspace as well as the other domains. International law applies to cyberspace as well as other domains, and we know that. Now, the challenge has always been that there's a gap. Jus ad bellum, UN Charter, as Ambassador Calderon talked about, governs the law as it applies to going to conflict, and there's plenty of principles, the four main principles governing targeting, jus in bello. But the Tallinn Manual fills that gap in many ways by restating existing principles and rules as they apply to cyber operations. Its importance to practitioners cannot be overstated. Everyone has been talking about this, at least in the legal community, and the release this year of Tallinn Manual 2.0. So we're very excited to have an all-star panel here, which I will introduce in a moment. At the same time, recall Henry Ford's quote. Henry Ford once said, "If I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses." So I think that type of thinking can also be applied to cyber law. Do we always know what we want? We may think we want more rules, laws, or regulations, but do we in fact? And also, of course, we don't know exactly what's coming. Maybe there's something out there we don't even know about which will change everything. One of the main lines of effort of the Army Cyber Institute is to advance the body of knowledge, and we certainly feel like we're doing that with this group here today. So I'd like to introduce to my immediate left the panel, starting with Professor Mike Schmidt, known to many of you as the general editor of the Tallinn Manual. He's a professor of public international law at Exeter Law School in the UK. He is the Stockton Professor at the Naval War College in Newport, and he's recently been named the Lieber Distinguished Scholar at the Department of Law at West Point. And among his many accomplishments, has recently received the President of Estonia's Order of the Cross of Terra Mariana, 4th class, for his work in promoting cyber defense and special service to the nation, which is basically an award that's only awarded to presidents and ambassadors and senators. He's written numerous publications. Your app and your bio have all of those. The entire panel, in fact, has written several wonderful publications, so we're not getting into that at the moment. But we welcome you, Mike.
Thanks, Rob.
Colonel Gary Korn, he is a U.S. Army JAG. He is the Staff Judge Advocate of United States Cyber Command, basically Admiral Rogers' lawyer. For my money and a lot of folks' money, the best and most knowledgeable practitioner of cyber law in uniform today. I can't even begin to tell you all of his accomplishments in this area of the law. No, seriously, I can't tell you his accomplishments in this area of the law. They're all classified. But the truth is, you can't think of a more strategically important position than what Gary is in right now with United States Cyber Command as the legal advisor. And he's got a great perspective on all of these issues. Thank you for being here, Gary.
Thanks, Rob.
Speaking of Estonia, as we were before with Mike, we have a great representative of that nation and the managing editor of the Tallinn Manual, Ms. Liis Vihul. Liis is the CEO of Cyber Law International. She was the advisor to the Estonian delegation for the UNGGE, discussed earlier today. And Liis, I just have to say, Mike has done so much work on behalf of Estonia, over the past 10 years, been recognized with individuals and leaders of that nation for his work on an annual basis. So I have to ask you, what on earth does this man have to do to get third, second, or first class for that award?
Well, I mean, we have pretty bumpy roads in Tallinn. If you could fix those, that would get you second class, I'm sure.
Actually, Rob, there are 282 levels, and I'm at level 4.
That's pretty good.
Just saying.
It's a big deal. And Lise has done also some great work in the area of international humanitarian law, of course. And we're pleased to have you. Welcome, Lise. Also, we have with us a great honor here to have Brigadier General Jen Buckner. General Buckner is with U.S. Cyber Command. She just came from a year as director of the Cyber National Mission Force. Right now, she's a deputy commander for JTF Ares, which many of you know is the counter-ISIS JTF working in the digital domain to defeat ISIS. She's a great friend of ACI and has accomplishments too numerous to mention here. Now, General Buckner, you have managed to find yourself on stage with 4 lawyers. As she says, these aren't my usual peeps. But I think it's good because simply based on that fact, it means the audience already likes her potentially better than the rest of us.
I think what she meant was a target-rich environment.
Welcome to you, ma'am. We're definitely looking forward to hearing your perspective. Thanks, Rob. So the game plan will be to ask a few structured questions, but quickly open it up to all of you. We want to hear your questions of the panel to have this wonderful group here today. I'm certainly not going to talk very much. I want you to hear from them, and I want you to be able to ask questions as they come up. But I'll be able to start the conversation. Of course, we have our disclaimer, which is that their comments don't necessarily reflect the Army Cyber Institute at West Point's position, but often in case they do, and in this case, are certainly for highly respected individuals in their field. So I encourage you to take the opportunity to ask them questions as we go along. So we'll start with Professor Schmidt. Get us started. Basically, for those who don't know, the Tallinn Manual, many in this room do know, but it was basically a compilation, as I said, of rules and principles of international law applying to cyber operations and cyber warfare. First published in 2013, above the use of force threshold, often viewed as a great compilation of rules on armed conflict. And then in 2017, this year, below the use of force threshold, peacetime operations are addressed in the updated version of the manual. Professor Schmidt was a general editor, as I said, and I asked him the first question, which is simply, Mike, the Tallinn Manual seeks to be an objective restatement of what the law is, not what the law should be, lex lata as opposed to lex ferenda. Can you briefly share with us the difference between those two items and why that distinction is so important in the context of the Tallinn Manual?
Well, lex lata is the law that is. It's the law that governs relationships between states, and sometimes the law that governs relationship between a state and their citizens, for example. The example would be human rights law. Lex ferenda is a clever Latin term, which simply means the law as it should be. The law as we would want it to be. The reason that that distinction was very, very important to us is because we wanted to have credibility with this manual. So we brought 19 experts from around the world in the second round. They range from China to Canada to Estonia. And we wanted this manual to be credible to people like the Colonel, because that was our audience. Our audience consisted of judge advocates, legal advisors to ministries of defense, legal advisors to ministries of foreign affairs, at the State Department here in the United States, or FCO in the UK, and so forth. And he didn't need, in terms of application of the law, in terms of advising his client, he didn't need to know what Mike Schmidt hoped the law would be. What he needed was a document that gave him the first cut at what we believe the law that currently governs cyber operations of his client, what that law was. And so we were obsessed with doing just lex lata. Now, that doesn't mean if we did only that was 100% agreed on, it would have been a very short book. There are times where we interpreted law, the 154 rules, where we came to different conclusions. But even where we came to different conclusions, for example, what is the meaning of sovereignty? We all agreed that sovereignty could be violated, could be breached, but we disagreed on when it was breached. Even when we disagreed, we made everyone swear on a stack of Bibles in front of 10 bishops that that was their view as to what the law was. And I believe that that was the success of the manual, because today, operators, of course, they may disagree with this or that point in the manual, but generally tend to agree with most of it because we were so obsessed with finding the law as it is today, and we had no desire whatsoever to shift the dialogue. And the last thing I would say about that was, it was very, very interesting. Lise and I were just in Korea last week, and we were talking to people, and there is this assumption that the first group, 20 experts, and the second group, 19 experts, would be influenced by their nationality. So we had someone from the United States, myself, Lise, Estonia. We had a Chinese fellow. We couldn't find a Russian who would participate, but we found a Belarusian, and if you're a kid from South Texas, that's probably just as good. So at any rate, we were stunned at the extent early on to which the lawyers in the group really did work hard to do law and not policy. And so there were times where the American lawyers disagreed with the US position on cyber. For example, I disagree with the US government's position, I'm speaking in my personal capacity here, disagree with the US government's position on issues surrounding the use of force and self-defense. And so I took a position in the manual contrary to the US government position, although we reflect that position in the manual. And I think the same was true, for example, of our Chinese colleague, who was just a wonderful attorney and professor from Wuhan University. Yeah, initially we were a little bit wary of each other, but over time we worked hard just to be lawyers and to leave our passports up in the hotel room.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. Gary, interestingly, a debate began here last year at CyCon and continued. Mike mentioned sovereignty. You actually went back after CyCon and wrote an article about this with your colleague Robert Taylor. And of course, the manual came out, and then Professor Schmidt and Ms. Vihul responded. And as regarding this idea, you seem to argue that sovereignty is an important part of international law, one that informs primary rules of conduct, but may not operate in and of itself as a binding rule of international law. Can you explain for our audience a little bit more about this argument and your perspective on this extremely important concept of sovereignty as applied to Tallinn 2.0?
Sure, a couple of things. The sequence was a little bit different of how these rolled out, but that's okay. Let me start by going back to some things that General Milley said earlier today, which I thought were really fascinating and important, and introduce a level of reality, good, bad, or indifferent, I think, into this discussion. As he talked about the changing character of warfare, it struck me as he was describing the disbursement of your forces and the greater disbursement of your forces with the greater lethality of weapon systems, ability to view the battle space, the time-distance factors of warfare. That's absolutely something that's happening in the virtual space of the cyber domain, right? So you see, to kind of analogize it to land warfare terminology, you see the opponents and adversaries able to set up assembly areas, assault positions, fire positions, command and control nodes in a very dispersed, spread out fashion, and as he noted, in ways that just don't conform to traditional notions of geography. That's creating a lot of stress. I think what the Tallinn manual, I was not directly a part, I was a peer reviewer on some portions of it, but I think what it set out to do was the process that Harold Coe talks about of translation of existing legal frameworks to new technologies in some sense. And that is a translation process. I speak a couple different languages. I know Mike does too. Things don't always translate word for word. So that's where you can get some interpretive differences. But I think within that translation framework and what's happening with this translation process in actuality, you see the stresses that technology puts on existing areas of law. This is one of them. So yeah, I mean, I've looked at this issue. I have a different starting approach from the approach adopted in Tallinn on the baseline concept of sovereignty as to whether it is a principle, and I don't dispute that it's a very, very important and significant principle in the international order, but is it itself a binding rule that states have ascribed to, or is it undergirding rules such as the prohibition on the use of force that are meant to protect sovereignty, but also recognize the sovereignty of states to engage each other in a permissive manner in their international relations. So that's a fundamental starting point. But I'll note, I think, sort of setting aside that baseline question, you can even see in the Tallinn manual that below the surface level recitation of the rules, there is that disagreement. There is questions, and the further you get down sort of the scale of effect, the more the consensus seems to dissipate among the experts who convene for the manual. So there's certainly, it kind of comes down to a threshold of consequence and harm. And I think Mike and company would even agree. There are certain cyber activities that would not breach the rule of sovereignty as they assert it, whereas I would say the rule is not a primary rule itself, and so we get to the same place with many of those. But there are definitely important consequences that flow from which position you take, and we can kind of develop that further.
And Harold Koh is Secretary of State's legal advisor.
He was the state legal advisor and is dean of Yale Law School now, yeah.
Lise, are you convinced by Gary's argument?
So I'll also take just a small step back and explain to those of you in the audience who are not lawyers what the debate is about that concerns sovereignty. So as the Colonel mentioned, he appears to take the view that sovereignty is an underlying principle of international law, but as an underlying principle, it does not prohibit certain cyber operations by a state against another state. So in other words, sovereignty exists as a principle, but it can't be violated such that it constitutes a breach of international law, which would then bring about all of the consequences that usually flow from violations of international law. For instance, certain responses, primarily countermeasures that would be available. And so Mike and I and the entire international group of experts in the Tallinn manual took a slightly different approach, and we said that sovereignty, in addition to being this underlying principle of international law, also, in a sense, constitutes a red line for certain cyber operations conducted by states against other states. In other words, there are some types of cyber operations that do constitute violations of sovereignty, in other words, breaches of international law. And there's one example that I usually like to give, and that is the Sony hack that was discussed earlier today. So if indeed that was carried out by a state, then my view is that that was a violation of the United States sovereignty because it infringed on the United States territorial integrity, which is an aspect of sovereignty, in such a way that that it constitutes a breach of international law. So this is where our debate lies. And after last year's panel, we went offline. We both, Mike and I, and Gary and his colleague, wrote articles articulating in more depth as to the legal basis of our respective views. So if you ask me, well, am I now convinced otherwise? In fairness, not really. I think that as a matter of international law, Mike and I stand on quite solid ground. We cite numerous cases from the International Court of Justice where the International Court of Justice ruled that there were violations of international law because they constituted violations of territorial integrity. And so I remain unconvinced, but I do understand where the policy aspect of the debate comes from, and I'm sure we'll be talking more about that.
Thank you, Lise. And General Buckner, I must ask you, as you listen to these lawyers talk about the sovereignty and the Tallinn manual, which this is an example of, or this is the manual actually, 154 rules over 600 pages, and I would have to ask you, ma'am, is that helpful to you as a commander to have this much guidance, rules, or do you prefer more flexibility, or are you somewhere in between?
I feel like Mike has let me off the hook somewhat, because as we were preparing for this, and talking about his intended audience, he said, this is absolutely not intended for you. It is intended for those who advise you. So I was a little relieved at that, because carrying around the book, perhaps that is not where our strength is, but to Gary's great credit, my direct legal advisor, his whole team and those who advise us indirectly, they all have their tabbed copies and they have read it from cover to cover and know it well. And so I think that becomes really the demarcation line in terms of our operational planning and execution, and then that's where we start to hand it off with those who do advocate on our behalf legally in the policy realm. So it provides a framework with which to really assess, understand, and even approve our operations. So I find it very helpful, not directly, but indirectly, because it gets us to a common framework and does support actual decisions on our behalf legally in the policy realm and then ultimately operationally. I would like to think that we challenge that on a daily basis, and as we can appreciate from this morning's discussions on the type of talent that we have within our force. I think sometimes the worst thing that we could do is hand them a rule book and say, here's exactly what you should do and how you should do it. And in fact, really lifting those restrictions and causing them or encouraging them to think creatively about who our adversary is, what the operational context is within, that we're working within, and work on and the technical means by which we can accomplish things. That's where our space is, but then probably at about my level is where we start to have the more the debates, if you will, and debates on sovereignty are things that happen daily, weekly, and I know I'm in trouble when Gary walks into my office and have you considered this? So not directly impactful on a daily basis, but definitely indirectly helpful in terms of explaining our operations to those who have a vested interest in their effects or a direct hand in their approval.
Great, thank you, ma'am. And I want to go to Gary real quick on this too, because he seems to be, he's a little bit between both worlds, right? But as a legal advisor, potentially expected to know this type of thing, but working time-sensitive operations on a daily basis. Same question to you, Gary. Does this help?
So I'm on record in multiple venues, written and otherwise, of heaping great praise on the manual and the authors. I'm privileged to know a number of them, and they're all phenomenal attorneys. It is a extremely helpful compilation of the substantive legal framework that you would look to map over to cyber operations. The sovereignty question, there are other points that certainly when you get below the surface of identifying what international law says generally and applying it to cyber, where there can be differences. And that's in part because we see every day how dynamic this space is, how every time you think you have your hands and handle around an issue, these very brilliant people will come in and say, we want to do X with X. And it causes you to have to step back and rethink. But you have an anchor in the legal framework that we all sort of start from. It's also very helpful part of the responsibility at the strategic level is these aren't easily answered questions. They're not clear. This is all very new stuff. State views and opinions are evolving. They're not clear at this point. And so the line between law and policy is extremely blurred. And in terms of advising on what the risks are in adopting a particular position or conducting a particular operation, it's certainly helpful to see this as a sense of what people are thinking out there, right? If we're going to do something that isn't necessarily conforming to exactly the way the Tallinn manual might approach something, you can kind of sense the basis of the criticisms that will come and help you think through that. So it's very, very helpful.
You know, I would say we weren't concerned about the criticism, Rob, during the process, because all of the experts in both the Tallinn Manual 1 and Tallinn Manual 2, what we wanted to do was energize the discussion. Until states made clear what their international legal policy was, we wanted to give them a tool they could use, and then we wanted states to take that manual and we wanted it to spark the sort of discussion, important discussion, we're having, for example, over sovereignty, over other issues like due diligence and taking countermeasures during peacetime. You know, it's my hope, at least, I don't know if Lise feels the same way, but I'm hoping that no one's reading the Tallinn Manual in a decade. I hope it's out of print and only historians refer to it as the first salvo in the development of international law or the understanding of international law in this area. And the reason is because we believe states and only states make international law. Mm-hmm. You know, pencil neck geek, lawyer, academics sitting in a room in Tallinn do not make international law. Colonel Korn makes international law when he works with national decision makers as to what the law is, and that's because law is crafted out of state practice and opinio juris. So what we're hoping is that out of this process, we'll start to see that state practice, although we're not naive. We know much of the state practice occurs out of sight, but what we're also hoping is that this causes states to begin to set out their international law positions and has to the nature of the existing norms when applied in cyberspace. And as this develops, there will be a critical mass of state opinions, of government opinions, that will eventually mature into the rules of the game, if you will. So in the perfect universe, 10 years out, no one's reading this, everyone's looking at a compilation of statements made by states as to how these various rules, whether it be attacking a civilian infrastructure during an international armed conflict, or whether it be how, you know, the topic that was discussed this morning, attribution. When do you attribute? What's the standard for attribution? What do you need to reach that standard, and so forth?
Right. And staying with you, Mike, well said, as always, but this morning we heard about gray zones in international law. Yeah. So switching just a bit before we open up to the audience, got to hear what Professor Schmidt thinks about this. He's written a seminal piece on this in Yale Journal of International Law. Can you share with us what you mean by gray zones, or the proficiency of certain states in exploiting gray zones of international law?
So, Madam Foreign Minister Marina, my friend, mentioned this morning. I've written a little piece. It's just looking at what we're seeing going on with respect to the application of law. Now, as Colonel Korn accurately said, there is a lot of law that is uncertain. We may agree, and Gary's a dear friend. We were laughing. We were trying to decide if we agreed on 97% or 98% of everything. We were just together last week at West Point, where we were channeling each other's thoughts. But there are some gray areas. We agree that there are gray areas. And a gray area of the law is an area of law where we're not so sure what the law is. And just to give you an example, states have an obligation, I believe that states have an obligation to ensure that their territory is not used to conduct cyber operations that have serious adverse consequences in other countries. That's called the due diligence obligation. It's just my view that this is the case. It was the view of the experts. But we kind of had a cat fight over the issue on whether or not states have an obligation to take preventive measures. In other words, measures to ensure their cyber infrastructure isn't exploited. So we all agree if you're placed on notice that bad stuff is happening from your territory, you got to the extent feasible, make the bad guys, whether they be other states or non-state actors, knock it off. But we couldn't agree on whether there was an obligation of prevention. Anyways, that's a gray area. It's an area of law where we're not so sure what the law is. In the first year of law school, they teach us the phrase, reasonable people differ. It's an area of the law where reasonable people differ. So anyways, my thought is that clever states, Russia, China in particular, what they're doing, they have spectacular lawyers, by the way. What they're doing is they're going out there and they're finding these gray areas in the law. Sovereignty. I happen to agree with Lee's and not Colonel Korn, but I admit that this is a gray area of the law. So Russia, China, they're going out there, they're finding these gray areas, and they say, that's where I'm going to operate. I'm going to operate within this legal gray area because it's hard for other states to pin the rose on me for violating international law. And moreover, because I'm going to engage states like the United States or France, that are law-abiding states, states that are committed to the rule of law, because it's a gray area, I've to some extent hobbled their potential responses. Because what they're going to do is they're going to go in, they're going to get their smartest lawyers there, their smartest policymakers and operators are going to get, and then they're going to argue about what the right response is. Why? Because the law is uncertain. So this is a very clever strategy by a number of countries to identify these gray areas, say, hey, we're going to operate within those gray areas. We, by contrast, we hesitate to operate within gray areas. I assume, you'd have to ask Gary, and he won't tell you. We hesitate because of our commitment to the international rule of law. We want to ensure that to the extent possible, to ensure that our operations are consistent with international law. So whereas this opens up many options to the other side, the bad guys, for us and for our closest allies, United Kingdom, Netherlands, and so forth, for our closest allies, this gray zone serves as a constraint. And so that's why Marina was citing the article this morning, because she and I are joined at the hip in believing that states need to clarify international law, because then they can leverage the impact of international law to some extent shut down their opponents.
General Buckner, do you see this in your work on a daily basis as an issue, or again, is it something that's great for the lawyers to talk about, but from a leader's perspective, you're not too worried about?
I enjoy this as an intellectual exercise and the spirited debate, and where we often talk in theoretical examples and analogies, we have operational examples that really do perhaps pull the string in a concrete way. But I would emphasize that, as Congressman Rogers alluded to, and meanwhile, the world, we have adversaries who are engaging us, and we are responsible to operational commanders. And so, that compels some people from our operational perspective to take a stand on where we are at that moment in time. And so I find the compelling nature of being responsible to operational commanders, and take a legal stand, take a policy stand, so that we can move the debate forward with actual operations. So I'd like to think that we contribute to it in a way, in some cases precedent in setting, and meanwhile the debate continues, but so do operations. And so that also, I think, informs the debate in perhaps 3.0.
Gary.
Yeah, no, it's really important, right, to recognize the operational reality of this. And the gray zone concept is really something that strategists have been developing for years, and it's kind of come to the fore in the last several years again. It's descriptive. It's often talked about in terms of gray zone conflict or challenges, but it's really descriptive of the environment. and it's much broader than legal ambiguity, although that's certainly a critical piece of it. It's states that are aggressively pursuing their objectives, principally revisionist states, trying to change the status quo to their favor in a way that pushes as far as they can up to establish red lines, right? So it's not limited to cyber. You see China's activities in the South China Sea, and building islands out of nothing, establishing presence further and further within the 9-dash line. I mean, these are typically are examples of what are typically described as gray zone activities. Cyberspace is fertile territory for this. And it isn't just the legal ambiguity, it's the attribution problems, it's states legally, whatever their legal position, states haven't come around to say, how are we going to handle this? And so you can push, and you can push. Personal opinion, but one of the realities in this space, I believe, is, and I'll quote former head of the National Security Division at DOJ, John Carlin. He was speaking at Duke last year, I think. Anyway, he said, we can't firewall our way out of this problem. You cannot firewall your way out of this problem. There are states out there that see this as a very lucrative, asymmetric, oftentimes cheaper than having to maintain conventional forces, but as a means of holding you at risk, advancing their interests aggressively. Sony is a classic example. They will do that. Naming and shaming only has so much value in countering this stuff. And so you've got to be able to operate. I think we're in a state of sort of persistent confrontation in this space, this zone below clear warfare. And that's where the law is struggling. Mm-hmm. The law is struggling to account for this, both from the ability to counter it, as well as how you couch advancing your own interests through this medium.
With that, let's open it up to the group. If there are any questions, we've certainly given you plenty to think about here in the first half of the panel. Any topic, if you just share with us who you're with and who you might direct your question to, or maybe the entire panel. Please, number one.
Hi, so I'm Glenda Jacobowski. I'm with NDU, the College of Information and Cyberspace. To anyone who wants to answer, regarding this gray zone confrontation and conflict and the thought of proportionality and being true to what we want to be true to as Americans and other democratic states, how do we answer it? It seems to me as though we show belly too often and we're over a barrel. So I wouldn't kill away our principles, but how do we counter this? That's it.
Who wants to take that? Mike, since you wrote the article, do you have a response to that question?
Proportionality wasn't one of the gray zones. I've never thought about it before. So, I mean, I guess proportionality is one of the areas where I think the law would benefit from some degree of clarity, particularly when you assess proportionality in the cyber context. There are actually multiple forms of proportionality, and they're all different. The word is used in 4 different areas of the law. Human rights law. It's used in the law of countermeasures, which is very, very important. For those in the audience who don't know, a countermeasure is an action taken by a state that would be unlawful, but for the fact that it is in response to another country's unlawful operation, and it's designed to get the other side to knock it off. And their proportionality considers such issues as the amount of harm you're suffering. In the law of self-defense, state self-defense, there is proportionality, but there it's different. Proportionality means that you may employ enough non-defensive force to defend yourself. So it's not related to how much harm you're suffering, but how much force, including cyber operations at the use of force level, you need to use to get the other side to stop. And then finally, in the law of war, law of armed conflict, when you're in the battle space and there's a fight on, when there's a war on, proportionality tells us that when we're conducting targeted operations, that the expected harm to civilians and civilian objects cannot be excessive relative to the military advantage. So you can't say proportionality. It appears in 4 different areas of the law, and it means something different in each case. And in almost every case, the law is a bit gray. And therefore, it's going to create risk for you, and it's going to limit your operations. To use a kinetic example, of course, in operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and elsewhere, the acceptable collateral damage level, the acceptable level of civilian casualties is extraordinarily low, and many would argue lower than the law demands. I think you're going to have the same sorts of dynamics in cyber. So to the extent that we can kind of operationalize the concept of proportionality as it's understood in each of these 4 areas of the law, that will be good, because as a law-abiding state, we will always seek to be well within the proportionate response. And our opponents, by contrast, will know that there's a margin of appreciation. This may be proportionality, but they're willing to engage in operations that many might perceive to violate it, but not everyone certain violates one of those 4 forms of proportionality. So again, it works to the enemy's advantage because we're lawmaking and they're not.
3, please.
I'm sorry, law-abiding, not lawmaking.
Katie Bogardus from DOTNE. You answered a little bit of my question already, so I apologize. But when we're talking about law, and we haven't even set domestic, potentially, laws in cybersecurity with consequences and enforcement necessarily that we are making well known to every one of our adversaries, how can we enforce or show that there's going to be consequences? Because we have indicted 5 Chinese citizens based on their actions with the cyber espionage, but without enforcement in another country, I'm not really sure how those legal laws become important or of use, or I guess I'm just wondering about the consequences. If you don't have consequences, why follow?
I mean, on the one hand, we don't, certainly us as a military and as a nation, we don't follow the law simply because there's a risk of consequences for not doing so, or concrete consequences, right? We follow the law out of a sense of doing the right thing, out of obligation, out of setting standards. There's a whole host of reasons, and there's absolutely, I've seen it throughout my career, great officers like General Buckner to my left and others, General Milley, who I advised when he was on the Joint Staff. I mean, this matters. This isn't just, oh, here comes the lawyer. These are concepts that are inculcated in all of us, and it has an effect on how you plan and build your operations. We had a J3 at Cyber Command. Lots of officers will often say, we want a lawyer that gets us to yes, right? He said, that's not what I want you to do. I want you to get me to right. That was a fabulous thing that he said, get me to right. So it's inculcated. It has an impact. Now, having said that, there are potential consequences depending on how you frame the issues, what's happening, what others are doing. Kind of interesting, and on the last question, if you think about proportionality in this sense, sometimes, at least to me, there's some counterintuitive thinking that goes on. As you move up the scale from retortions, right, which are lawful actions that states can engage in against each other, even if they're unfriendly or prejudicial to the other state, to countermeasures, which Mike described, to uses of force and military force, proportionality applies at each stage, but it expands at each stage. And so I know Mike has raised concerns, not to round it back to the sovereignty question and beat that horse, but understandable and legitimate concerns that if you raise the bar of what is not prohibited activity up to the non-intervention or use of force standard, you're opening up the aperture for a host of malicious activity, which can be escalatory. I think it's actually the counter to that. I think if you lower that bar, you're now opening it up to countermeasures.
Oh, no.
Which is not as confined and constrained as what you could do to counter malicious activity in this space under a retortion framework. This is very similar to some of the arguments in favor of the use of force gap between Article 2.4 and the Armed Attack Standard in Article 51.
UN Charter. These, real quick. Before Mike
With regard to your question, yeah, I realize that what you're saying is that, yeah, you may indict them, but you can't put them in prison because they're in China, right? But, I mean, there is still some value even to this indictment. So, because it does put enormous personal limitations on those individuals. So, not only do they have to refrain from traveling to the United States, but they also have to refrain from traveling to any country that is likely to extradite them to the United States. So in that sense, I think it's using law to send a deterrent message to other countries. And the same applies to some extent to international law. So when we say that, okay, so once you get to the conclusion that the cyber operation has violated international law, well, what does it give us? Because we can't really enforce international law. Well, international law does have so-called self-help measures that states are entitled to. So if there has been a breach of international law vis-a-vis Estonia, for instance, then Estonia is entitled to take what are called countermeasures, which is a form of self-help, in order to induce the wrongdoing state to stop its wrongful conduct. And the more grave the act is that is directed against the state, the more grave self-help measures international law foresees to the victim state. So, I mean, even though domestic and international law in this context aren't perfect, they're better than nothing, I would say.
Thank you, Lise.
I would say, just in response before I comment on Gary's comment, I would say that we need to be careful about saying everything's really, really, really hard in cyber, at least with respect to the application of international law. In one sense, I believe that cyber is more enforceable than in the non-cyber context, and that's with respect to countermeasures. Because in the non-cyber world, it's difficult to take countermeasures. I mean, what are you going to do? Close your territorial sea to Russian fishing boats? I mean, I doubt that Russia will collapse over the lack of US fish. But in cyberspace, if the Russians not only conduct unlawful activities against us in cyberspace, but in any other domain, then that opens the door, legal door, to the taking of countermeasures against Russia. So by cyber or other means, but in particular by cyber means. So I really think at least in the context of countermeasures, which in my mind represent, at least in theory, a very effective response to the unlawful activity of other states, cyber opens up lots of opportunities. Now, with respect to Gary's comment, so I just want to explain why I think there was not an expert one that believed this was an issue when we were going through the Tallinn manual. Moreover, we met with 50 states and international organizations, and there was not concern, no one expressed a concern that the rule of sovereignty was not a rule of international law that could be breached. And it's important, because if it can be breached, then we can say you're a bad guy, and then we can take countermeasures in response. And so this did catch us by surprise when this came up last year when Gary and I were on the panel together. Lise was on the panel along with someone from the State Department. It caught us by surprise, but it has become a valid gray area in international law because it is starting to catch on in other states, this notion that there's no rule of sovereignty which is breached, that you got to look for something else they did wrong. For example, intervention in the internal affairs of another state. Here's why I think that's a bad approach for the United States to accept. Back in the good old days of the Cold War, the United States wielded, and I think we still do, wielded disproportionate hard power, okay, military power. So in such an environment, it was good for us to keep the threshold for tripping over into unlawfulness high. And I'm sorry, high. And the reason is because if we violated the law, who was going to take us on? Okay? Who was going to take us on? The problem here in cyber is the answer is lots of countries are going to take us on. Lots of countries are going to take us on. So if we leave open this space, if we don't render it unlawful, then that leaves lots of space for lots of enabled countries, and sovereignty only applies to countries, leaves lots of space for lots of enabled countries to conduct operations against us. So the reason I think we should embrace this lower threshold is because we want to use the law as a deterrent to the many, 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 many more states that can cause us harm than in the good old days when the Sixth Fleet was dominating the Mediterranean and so forth. So I accept the point that this is a valid, sophisticated debate. I don't think the opposing view is crazy. I think it's an important debate. But from the perspective of the United States, we should be embracing this lower threshold because we want to use what little authority international law has to label the other side of a cyber operation, and now there are many states that can constitute that other side, label them lawless. Because if they're lawless, for example, it's easier for us to go to other states and seek their assistance in the operations and so forth. So I'm very nervous about this. Now, I will say that, you know, I teach at the Naval War College. I want the Americans to be able to employ cyber power whenever it's in the nation's best interest. I will say that my position comes at a cost, and you must understand that. The cost is that it will limit those because we are law-abiding, we will abide by those rules. It comes at the cost of it will limit the type of operations that we can conduct abroad. But I believe that the answer to that question is not to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say there's no such thing as a rule of sovereignty, but rather to say there is a rule of sovereignty. Let's have a mature discussion about when that rule is violated. As Lee said, the international group of experts could only agree that it was violated in 3 circumstances. One, when something was broken. I mean, physically broken. Okay? The old video of something catches on fire or has a result of conducting a cyber attack, there's damage. 2, when someone's injured, made ill, suffers incredible mental suffering. And 3, when the cyber operation in some way significantly or permanently affects the functionality of something. In other words, it just flat dab doesn't work. That's it. Below that threshold, we were all over the map. And that's the debate we ought to be having. So we shouldn't fear the rule of sovereignty because we can use the rule of sovereignty. The debate we need to be having in the interagency process is, okay, we embrace sovereignty, sovereignty's good, but let's figure out what the rules of the game are. What interpretation is most in our national interest?
Thank you, Mike. But panel 2 has been very patient. Gotta go. Quick response, Gary?
Yeah, just quickly. I mean, there's no doubt that you know, clarity in international relations, like in business and elsewhere, can be very helpful. But I'd also say that that approach, one, that's the policy you suggest should be adopted and so on. That is bleeding very much into the Ferranda world of a policy argument versus what the law, the extant law is. And it is also very much, I'd say, static in the sense of how bilaterally states will engage and doesn't necessarily take into account the fact of the internet itself and how things are operating. And so what you're going to find, leaving aside the non-state actor problem I've sort of raised in the Just Security Post and other places, you now have threat actors, states, as you allude to, who can conduct operations. One, they already are. It's happening. They're doing it now.
But why would you force?
Let me finish. And they're doing it.
Tell them to wait.
Take control. I'm in charge.
They're doing it not just from their infrastructure in their state, straight direct to the targeted infrastructure. It is ubiquitously spread out across the internet, implicating the territory of multiple states, and it becomes essentially unworkable in a response framework and the ability to counter some of this stuff. So,
Okay. But the problems you cite are handled by the principle of due diligence. Because if you have terrorists or just bad guy hacktivists in another state that are conducting operations against you that are causing serious adverse consequences in the United States, then those states have a legal obligation to make them knock it off. And if those states fail to comply with that legal obligation, then you don't have to worry about the sovereignty of that state when you shoot back into them. It's just like going after terrorists with drones. The law here is no different.
No, it is different, and we know it's different because it's a different problem set and a different legal basis under the self-defense level. And that not everybody agrees with the application of the due diligence principle in this space as well. So there's a bit of a house of cards problem that you have. If you pull that out, and I refer to Brian Egan's Berkeley speech,
You're right.
right?
You're right.
So if you pull out due diligence, you are, in a sense, remediless against a large portion of the threat vectors out there. So, it's all got to come together, I would agree. And there's the pressure. It's the pressure on adopting due diligence, which has other baggage with it. It's not a purely good tool from a privacy concern perspective. Do you put more pressure on countermeasures to expand what countermeasures can be used for and taken against? There are a lot of limitations on countermeasures. All of these just demonstrate that they don't align perfectly to this space. And effectively, it's going to take time for states to develop this area in an area where I think sovereignty has always, all these issues have always been a clash between the internal sovereign interests and the external sovereign interests of states, and you come to sort of compromise positions, Innocent Passage being, I think, a classic example of this. But
Please break the tie for us.
I'm not sure I'm going to break the tie here, but so just giving you how it might seem to an outsider. I mean, if there is no rule of sovereignty, and if the red lines are at the breach of non-intervention principle and the use of force prohibition, then everything basically that doesn't have a physically injurious or destructive effect, or that doesn't coerce into the internal affairs of a state, which an example of which would be hacking into election systems and changing the return of the vote, then all of that would be perceived as permissible under international law. And I understand that domestically here, at least, this debate has arisen in the counter-terrorist operations context. And so let's say that we've got some ISIS cyber infrastructure in Estonia. The impression that I get from this debate is that it would be permissible for the United States to hack into ISIS cyber infrastructure in Estonia and cause, let's say, functional damage, significant functional damage to the cyber infrastructure without needing the consent of Estonia for that operation. And I think that well, I'm not a representative of Estonia. I just, do law. But I think that Estonia, or for that matter, any other country, might find it problematic that another state is operating on cyber infrastructure in its territory to that significant extent.
Excellent. So we'll keep that. We'll all go write our articles, and then we'll talk about it more next year. But excellent debate. Number 2 has been very patient. Please.
Tell us how you really feel about sovereignty. I'm just kidding. My question's not about sovereignty. I'm Major Will Toronto with the Air Force. My question is about state practice. This is for any and all of you. To your understanding, has any state officially accused another state of violating international law using cyber means such that would trigger mechanisms in international law to respond? And does the absence, or possibly presence, if I'm just not aware, of such, how does the absence of that affect the development of customary international law in this space?
Please.
So, it's funny, but I can't seem to think of any single case right now. But I'm wondering if your argument is solidly grounded in law in the first place. Sorry about that, but I'm thinking that if you're looking for state practice and opinion juris to say that a norm of international law has been breached, I mean, you don't need to look for state practice and opinion juris to say that something has been breached. I mean, that doesn't determine whether sovereignty or the prohibition of intervention have been violated in the first place. We need state practice and opinion juris to conclude that a norm exists, like the prohibition of the use of force or the obligation to respect sovereignty. And so we can say that, yes, those rules exist, but then for them to have been breached, I mean, that's a separate question. It's a question of fact then. You don't need subsequent state practice and opinion juris to conclude that they have been breached.
But you do need it to rise to the level of a principle of customary national law, which in this space can be viewed as tantamount to law.
It's a fair question. You got to be careful not to draw too much from inaction at times. For example, states have engaged in activities against other states that perhaps could have given rise to consider use of force and given the rise to the right of self-defense, but the affected state chooses to respond in lesser means, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that that state had the opinion that they weren't subject to a use of force. However, in this area, which is so new, and with the number and level of malicious activity that's constantly happening, I think it does bear some thought as to, we've not yet seen, it doesn't take much for a state to do exactly what Mike is suggesting and name and shame based on violations. So I would say it does have some bearing, cautiously, but some bearing on the question of whether states really view these lines as this clear. And if they did, they would be asserting these violations, I think, more actively.
Number 3.
Ross Rutter, U.S. Air Force. Actually, the good major had my question, so I'm going to generalize mine instead. Do you think that the attribution problem is one of the biggest obstacles to the norming process of international law?
To the what?
Norming process?
Normative process?
Norming.
What process?
Norming?
Norming.
Or
Norming.
Establishing norms.
Establishing norms?
of norms in this area.
Okay.
Thinking about Cheers.
Norm.
What do you think, Mike? Attribution.
So, attribution is, first of all, I'm not a technician. The right person to ask is the general, okay? Not me. We must always distinguish between factual attribution and legal attribution. Factual attribution is, do I know it happened? And, to what degree do I believe it happened? What's my degree of certainty? Legal attribution is a complex body of law. It depends on who the actor is. Is it another state? Is it a non-state entity acting as a state? Is it a non-state entity acting on the instructions, direction, or control of a state? Blah, blah, blah. I could go on and on. It's a huge section of the manual and of international law based on the articles of on state responsibility by the International Law Commission. The biggest problem we have in attribution in law is establishing the degree of certainty, because if we're talking about, if we take it out of the realm of tribunals, which have their own level of proof, and we're just talking about how states act, the level of certainty is reasonableness. Now, I can tell you that as an attorney that it's reasonableness, but what's reasonable to the general? Because she's the operator and she represents the state, not me, and she understands. So I think the work that needs to be done, quite aside from the factual, get it right when you do attribution, the work that needs to be done is all about operationalizing the concept of reasonableness or the degree of certainty. In other words, what does that mean? So I can now, for example, put it in my rules of engagement, so I can now inform operators and national decision makers.
Ma'am.
I would just add, the additional factor to consider here is the disclosure associated with attribution, and clearly there's a careful calculus in, by establishing attribution to the various levels that Mike describes. You may, by that very nature, really prevent some things in the future. So that calculus is a fairly substantial one that perhaps does sometimes outweigh the lure of establishing attribution to a public standard, which would be acceptable both legally and again, that the public would understand.
I would say an interesting thing on attribution came up during the Hague process when we were consulting with the states. We did this on the basis of non-attribution, so I can't tell you which state, but there was one state that said, listen, if you're going to say we did it, then you have to produce the evidence to back up your claim. And pretty much all the other states, and certainly the experts, looked at that state and said, you got to be kidding me. That ain't going to happen. That's not the law. That's simply not going to happen, so forget it. And that did not make it into the manual. That's considered a wrong view. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. I would say, though, because of the uncertainty, if you're going to make the accusation, you better back it up. I think that's the general approach, right? And so the bar, I think, is set higher than the legal bar, right? Which is, makes states reluctant to name and shame. And you add into it the factor of what is the basis of your accusation? Where are you getting your evidence from? There's a very, very challenging calculus you have to go through, as General Buckner alluded to.
And I'll just ask for the whole panel, we have several cadets and students in this room who may be interested in the intersection of this area, this fascinating field, cyber law. How might they get into it besides just, going to law school if they want the law side and going to cyber branch if they want cyber? Any guidance to them that any of you all may have, or just an idea as to where we're headed with all this? It's a great discussion, but of course the theme of the conference is the future of cyber conflict, so we want to be sure to talk a little bit about that too. We have alluded to that, but any thoughts on where we're headed, where these young folks may look in the future besides the great idea of 3.0, Tallinn 3.0 being promulgated?
I really like the idea that we highlighted the size of Army Cyber today, 20,000 people, U.S. Cyber Command, there's a joint force associated with that. And we talked about the cyber branch, but really I think the strength in Army Cyber's organization is the diversity of talent and the multidisciplinary approach that they take. And beyond the nucleus of some cyber specialists, there are intelligence specialists, there are technicians, there are historians, there are policy advisors, there are futurists. There are so many ways to contribute in this fight, and it is literally precedent setting on a daily basis. And so the idea that, that you can enter that force, and the true strength of our force is really at the junior, that 27-year-old and below. What a tremendous opportunity to make an impact both across the department as well as in defense of our country. So it's pretty extraordinary that I think that diversity of talent and the diversity of opportunities Army Cyber and Cyber Command offer in that respect.
Well said. Well said. One last question is number 3. Oh, sorry, response?
Oh, no.
Okay.
Well, I mean, so I guess as a retired Air Force officer, and in retaliation for the soup's comment about Air Force Army football this morning, I might suggest to all of the West Point grads, when you graduate, go Air Force. I think that's your real future.
You can see how
Air Force in the
good
room.
Mike's advice is.
3, please. We've got about 2 minutes left. Love to hear your question.
I appreciate the honor of the last question. My name is Donna Artuzzi. I'm with the Chaired Off Group. I'm wondering if, I guess this question is for any and all of you, can you speak to the effect of NATO elevating cyber to its own domain last year and what you think will trigger the use of Article 5 regarding the cyber domain? Thanks.
With regard to Article 5, that's, I mean, although NATO hasn't really clarified where the threshold lies, it has just only said that certain cyber operations may trigger Article 5. I'm quite confident that the threshold will remain very high, which is that NATO will be looking for significant injury, death, damage, or destruction, or if we're talking about like cyber-only or non-kinetic effects, something very, very serious happening to a state, somehow forcing the state really down to its knees. So by acknowledging that Article 5 applies, I don't think NATO has in any way lowered the armed attack threshold, and it will still be looking for very serious damage for collective defense.
We're just about out of time. I do want to just say that we can talk on the margins of this wonderful topic, but the bottom line is that the manual represents a great step forward in this area of the law. It's a fantastic development, and as Mike said, it's codifying. Its intent is to get states to maybe move forward and move out and have a stance on a particular area, and may not be necessary in the future. But again, some have suggested that more have read this manual than the combined works of Hugo Grotius, the father of international law. So that's pretty impressive, actually.
Yeah, but I was the guy that
Oh, that was you.
suggested
That was you. But all practitioners know that this is it's on a lot of leader lists for reading, and it's certainly a great guide to have handy for all of you in the particular area. We're going to hang out. We have Senator Rounds coming, so we're going to have to clear the stage, but we're going to hang out if anyone has any questions. Want to thank our wonderful panelists for a great job today. Fascinating debate. Thank you all very, very much. We're going to give them some gifts, so we'll take a break now. Thank you.